Let's talk about it. Let's go deep. We all have something to share. No share with Dr. Dave.
Hello and welcome to the Now Share with Dr. Dave podcast. This is Dr. Dave Cornelius, your host, and today I am having the wonderful opportunity of having a conversation with Salah. And then I am going to tell you that, just give you a definition of social justice, right? And so the way we define it, or the way we've captured it, is social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities, that social workers aim to open the doors of access opportunity for everyone, particularly those in the greatest need. So when we think about all of the different ways that we want to think about social justice, we could think of it in terms of equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal treatment. So in short, social justice means equal rights and equitable opportunities for all. So, hey, Salah, what's going on? Why don't you take a minute and provide like a quick elevator pitch about who you are? And I always like to talk about people's superhero persona, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And thanks for inviting me. I like this idea of superhero persona. I would say like my superhero persona is mostly is like a super curious and courageous kid who gets to ask why over and over and then get to ask it again. My kids reminds me of that constantly, especially when it's not why, it's why not. But jokes aside, I am a certified coach, coactive coach, and also I'm an ICF professional certified coach. And my focus has been on agile coaching for the last 10 years or so. And I like to facilitate teams and individuals and help leaders and teams become better one day at a time. I also like to help individuals, teams, and leaders balance clarity with action. And my mission is really to spark courageous curiosity with play, and hopefully, sprinkle a little sense of humor on that as well. But that's in a nutshell.
So let me ask you this, right? How does social justice challenges show up in your experience as an agile coach?
Yeah. For me, the social justice shows up in different ways. I'll focus maybe on a couple and see where that takes us. But the main one that I see often is acknowledgement. How do we acknowledge, does the company or the team or the group acknowledge the different voices, and invite the different perspectives at the table, and welcome dissent and have different views of things. Or are the voices being ignored? These voices are being ignored, and the dominant voices, or the dominant voice, continues to be the dominant. And so I believe, that leadership has a big role in this, encouraging and inviting different voices to the table. And sometimes as coaches, coaching, even though we know that it's not about telling people what to do, but it's about, showing or holding a mirror for what's going on in the group. So that's where, as a coach and as a leader, I try to invite the voices and allow for equal opportunities and different perspectives in the group. So that's one. The other one is listening. So listening to what's going on, how things are being discussed. I usually, say, or I learned in my journey, that if you want to gauge a culture of a company or a group, just attend their meeting and see how they interact with each other. And listening goes hand in hand with the expression. It's one thing to encourage expression and to encourage this openness in culture, but it's another thing to, pay attention and listen to what's really going on. And not just to what's being said, but what's what remains to be unsaid. So it takes, that's another thing that feels like, as an agile coach, I don't, only have to continue to, invite the group and have people share their perspectives and try to help the voices that are quiet in the group, say what's on their mind. And so that's another one is listening. And then the last one is to try to asking good questions, and having this, curiosity around like what's going on with some, with people who are not really sharing their ideas and their stories and their, frustrations. And I find that to be, one of the things that doesn't, that usually doesn't come up often is like asking questions, being curious about what's happening with the group, what's happening with an individual. And I've been learning, I know when we talked last time, we talked about like clean language. I've been learning about clean language recently. And, one of the saying that I learned from the clean language community is this idea of where attention goes, energy flows. And one of the most powerful way to direct attention and energy is a good question, is a question. And so those are three main things that show up in my work as an agile coach. And I think it's applicable not just to teams and companies, but to, communities as well.
That's excellent. I'm glad that you're using clean language. I mean, that is a great practice. To be able to come up with various models. So sometimes I find that, when I'm in a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes I feel that people, speak to me as if I'm a victim. What about you?
Yeah, I think, if I think back, I may have, there maybe have been instances where I felt that way. I think in the beginning of my professional journey, I kind of sensed that in some ways, but I think today, maybe because I've been, working on myself and how to, to take, what people say at face value. I mean, sometimes, obviously, you have to understand where the person is coming from, or what are they trying to say, not what they actually said. But I don't think that I have felt that that someone spoke to me as a victim. I don't, or at least I don't remember. Maybe. But I think that's probably possible because I'm focusing on improving the dialogue and seeing, what's going on with that person. What's, if they're trying to have a conversation, they're trying to, connect. Is this their idea of connecting? Or is that more like, they're trying to feel sorry for me, which I don't usually, I don't buy into, like, people trying to make me feel sorry for myself or feel sorry for me.
I understand that. But what in terms of, if have you observed that where others are speaking, when we're talking about DEI, that others are speaking of other people as if they're victims in the process?
I'm trying to think of an example, especially within the community that I'm part of, like, the Agile community. If I have seen something that or heard about, like, someone speaking about someone as a victim, I don't recall, like, some of these discussions, like, having someone speaking about someone as a victim. I recall the work that we've been doing is to bring other people to the table and try to figure out, like, how do we contribute to equity and social justice in the community. um, and that's really, I guess, again, like, maybe that's where I'm paying attention more. And like the saying with clean language I just mentioned, like, where attention goes, energy flows. So my energy is trying to focus on how do we improve the dialogue of social justice, how do we improve the equity in the community, where people, in the BIPOC community has more opportunities and expression, and bring more diversity to in our community. So I may have not been paying attention to to that, the dialogue about someone trying to make other person feel like a victim.
No, that's fair. That's fair. So, what about the economic impact of social injustice in your life?
That's an interesting question. It's hard to quantify, the economic impact, but in the beginning of my journey, a professional journey, I thought naively that, there are, things are equal opportunities exist for everyone. It's a fair game and all that. But now I know different. I realize that's not the case. There's a lot of work to be done in this domain. But I think there is, there is some impact, economic impact on me or people like me. But I never took a step back to evaluate what is the economic impact, or maybe put a number on it. I know for a fact that there is an intangible aspect of it. It's more of a psychological impact, or safety impact, and that definitely comes with that could have another dimension, which is the economic impact. If I'm not feeling like I can speak up or express my views in a way that is authentic, then that can come, with an economic impact. That can have an economic impact on my work.
Understood. So let's pivot and talk about a few actions that you're taking personally to improve opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, in the Agile community.
Yeah, I actually, this the past couple of years, I've been taking a few actions, or more actions to help in that area, and I'm definitely hoping to do more with that. And one of the things that come to mind, the first thing that comes to mind is basically this dialogue that we had last year, that was facilitated by April Jefferson, and opening the space around the dialogue with the Agile Alliance and the Agile community, and trying to invite different perspectives, and work together to find ways to encourage more BIPOC voices and representation, in the group, in the community. And then another thing that I really was hoping to do, or I did last year, and early last year before the pandemic, was I co-organized an Agile conference called Agile Charm in Baltimore, and as far as I know, that's one of the first Agile conferences in the area. Besides the DevOps conference that has been happening in Baltimore for the past for 3 years before then. And one of the things that we were keen on as a group, as co-organizers, is to find a diverse group of speakers. So we tried to balance and invite different voices and have a really diverse group in terms of, you know, who speaks at the conference and that sort of thing. You know, the other thing I'm you know, the last year also, or maybe this actually recently, I came across an organization called Coaching for Everyone, which has a mission to really, you know, bring more professional coaching to the BIPOC community. It has been offering not just coaching, access to coaching for BIPOC population, but also it's helping people become professional coaches themselves. So not only helping people to become professional coaches and help the community in that area, but also you know, sponsor or help support, you know, people in the BIPOC population become professional coaches themselves. And then I'm hoping next year I'll be part of the Agile for Humanity and support that work as well. Yeah, I mean, those, you know, these are things that just off the top of my mind, but I'm really interested in supporting and giving back to the community based on and sharing my experience and my journey, you know, and hopefully, you know, people find it useful.
Well, I can't wait to hear your topic in the Agile for Humanity conference next year, February. So I'm totally excited that you are willing to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you mentioned it last time we spoke, and I was really, you know, excited to be part of it and to support any way I can. So I can't wait for next year to see what you know, what you have and support it.
Likewise. So let's talk about significant changes you would like to see to support BIPOC and non-BIPOC integration in the Agile community, because we know there's a huge disparity. So the question is that what kind of changes you would like to see, you know, take place?
Yeah, I think having, you know, there are some things that I would like to see happen. I think some of it is already happening, like the open spaces or the conversation, the dialogue that has been hosted recently. I would like to see that happen more often. You know, having people share their experience, share their stories. Also build this network of people who can, you know, support each other, you know, in terms of professional work and also, you know, personal growth and development. So that's one area. And then the other is to be intentional about these spaces. Sometimes these are, you know, this is a difficult conversation. This is not an easy conversation to have, especially, you know, if people are not, you know, haven't had it before. They haven't been able to bring it up. And it helps to be intentional about building that kind of space that will allow for people to express their, you know, their perspectives and their thoughts, you know, freely, right? And how do we design for that? There is a book, I think, that I recently came across, and it's called the Art of Gathering, you know, or something like that. I think it's just like, you know, designing open spaces or designing open space using open space, but it's also, you know, being intentional about how do we set up that space or gathering for people to be able to express their views and encourage the dialogue. And then I think the last thing that I would really like to see is some sort of concrete and actionable steps, you know, for us as a community. You know, if there is this disparity, and, you know, I know that it exists, how do we bring the, you know, this disparity closer, or find ways to encourage, you know, more you know, coaches from, you know, from the BIPOC to be able to to find opportunities, and whether support through coaching or through mentorship programs. Just like the organization I mentioned, the Coaching for Everyone, it's doing this type of work in the professional coaching world. Maybe that's something that we could do in the Agile community, or the Agile sponsored by the Agile Alliance, or some other organizations in the Agile space. So some sort of action and concrete steps forward. It's good to have the dialogue, but then what next? Like, what's next for us to do after the dialogue?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the so what, now what.
Yes, right? Exactly.
Yeah. We talk about all this stuff, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now that we have the dialogue, what we do next.
Yes, exactly. But one thing, I like to talk about Utopia, and in terms of, like, if we had to have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, what would that utopia look like for you? Because in order for us to know what to do, we need to have a vision, right? Mm-hmm. And so I like to go to the maximum, edge of time or edge of the vision and say, well, what does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough and powerful question. I mean, what it would look like in the future, or utopia. I imagine, I think the key word in the question that you framed is this idea of belonging. I think it's important to have that sense of belonging, and to have a sense of belonging, there needs to be some, people need to feel heard and seen. And I know it might not be utopia, but it might be simple, but it's not easy, because I don't think that sense of belonging is there, or at least it still need to be to be intentional about creating that sense of belonging, as a community, or as coaches in the Agile space, working with organizations to help teams deliver work. And the way that we do that is by creating a shared purpose, a common goal, and bringing everyone voice to the table. We need to do the same thing for the community. How do we create that sense of belonging and be intentional about creating the sense of belonging? I don't know if that's utopia, but that's my utopia, is to have, is to have that shared sense of belonging.
Well, everyone is going to have their own utopia, right? Yeah. And the key is to make sure that everyone's utopia is heard and expressed. Maybe we may do a mashup, or like a mashup of all of our utopias, and something beautiful will come out of that expression, right?
Yeah. I mean, I know you're interviewing me, but I would like to know, what's your utopia? What do you think utopia looks like?
I sit in a space with you where it's simple. It's about belonging. Right. And I believe that's where it starts. If you don't have a vision of where you want to go, it's hard to go somewhere. Right. I mean, you'll get somewhere, we just don't know where. But I believe that having a vision of what belonging looks like for each of us individually, or even collectively, it's a really important first step. And then we could go back and deal with all of the other stuff of healing and trauma along that path. But if we have a vision, we can certainly work toward that, right, in small steps.
Yeah, I think finding people that we can relate to, and who share our story or experience, or have like some sort of idea about to connect with what we're saying, is very important. And that's part of the belonging, is if there is no shared experience, or at least we are not creating that shared experience as a community, then it's going to be very hard to have that sense of belonging, and it's going to be very hard to get to that utopia, or get where we want to get to.
Yeah, but as each of us as the individuals and as a collective continue to do this work, right? The conversation that I had in your podcast, the coaching conversation, the fact that you're on my podcast, and this broadcast is also in partnership with Agile Alliance. So for the last year, I've been having conversations with people about, their experience in the Agile community, dealing with social justice, or, as BIPOC individuals. I think the more of these that we do have, it gives a space. It starts to create this space organically that we could start organizing around different topics, right?
Yeah.
And different commonalities that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you know, the first step usually in change or coaching people to help them with change is to bring awareness, and raising awareness, like you said, by talking about it and having these conversations can help, at least can lead to change, or can lead to what's next. Now what, right? Now what?
Yeah. So what? Now what? Right?
So
yeah, I mean, it's beautiful. So I mean, it's one of the reasons why we have the whole Agile for Humanity conference, because it's an aim to bring many different voices to have different conversations. So we want to see where that leads to.
Yeah, it's it's very, that the kind of work that you're doing, and you're kind of trying to build the community around having these conversation is very similar to the work that we're doing in organizations. So if it's very if we're doing this in the organization, and we need to also do it in our community, where we can bring or support different groups, people who are under represented or underestimated into into the Agile space, and that will help us create that sense of belonging that we're talking about.
Yeah, without a doubt. Hey, is there anything else you'd like to add as we wrap up our conversation?
I'm really happy to be on your podcast. I'm honored that you invited me, and I appreciate all the work that you do for the community, and how you're pushing the limits and bringing this to the discussion, and to have these conversations and dialogue. So I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to support the next event, and hopefully that will lead to much more events, and hopefully we get us to Utopia that we're talking about.
Without a doubt. So, I mean, just thank you so much. Thank you for, for connecting. I know we met quite a few years ago in Southern California at a coach camp. So that was wonderful. And the fact that we continue to have dialogue over the years, it's really appreciative. And thank you for also inviting me to be on your podcast as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. So let me close. And I'd like to say thank you for listening to the Knowledge Share with Dr. Dave podcast. I hope this learning experience would also prompt you to take and seek more and discover how we can contribute to positive experiences for BIPOC lives. It really doesn't take much. All we have to do is to tap into our own humanity. So there's a few places that you're going to find this recording, and you'll find it on the Agile for Humanity podcast, at Knowledge Share with Dr. Dave on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and now on Audible. And it'll also be in a few different websites, like the agilealliance.org website, knowledgeshare.com as well. So, The music for this podcast was written by my niece, Kiana Brow Hendrickson. This podcast is copyright 2021, Nalshire and Dr. Dave Cornelius. So until next time, be well, stay safe, and connect soon.
Let's talk about talk. Let's go deep. We all have something to share. No share with Dr. Dave.